Growing up in my family felt like living under a spotlight that never shone on me unless it was to highlight how I fell short of expectations. From the moment I could form coherent thoughts, I was captivated by science. At 8 years old, I remember sitting cross-legged on my bedroom floor, surrounded by dismantled clocks and tattered scientific journals, while Ava dazzled our parents' friends with theatrical performances downstairs. The faint hum of their applause seeped through the walls as my mother's voice echoed, "Why can't you be more like your sister? She's lively, graceful, everything a girl should be." Her words stung, not because they were new, but because they carried the weight of an unspoken truth. I was the disappointment, the shadow cast by Ava's golden glow. When my 10th birthday arrived, I dared to dream. With trembling hands, I presented my carefully written wish list to my parents. A chemistry set topped the page, its image gleaming from the catalog I had practically memorized. But instead of delight, my request was met with derision. My father laughed, shaking his head. "Chemistry? For a girl? What will you do with that? Mix potions in the kitchen." My cheeks burned as he tossed the list aside. That evening, I found a stack of used novels on my bed, their spines cracked and pages yellowed. "Books are practical," my mother said curtly when I asked about them. "They'll teach you to be softer, more refined." Softness, refinement, these were virtues I was told I lacked, qualities Ava seemed to embody effortlessly. The disparity between us only grew sharper over time. While Ava twirled in ballet classes funded by mysterious savings my parents miraculously unearthed, I begged for membership in the school science club, only to hear my mother groan about the cost. "You need to focus on making friends," she advised, as though friendship could somehow compensate for the dreams they refused to nurture. It wasn't just neglect. It was active dismissal. Each rejection chipped away at my confidence, leaving behind a hollow ache that no experiment or discovery could fill. Yet even then I clung to my passion, retreating into the solace of equations and hypotheses where logic reigned supreme. Little did I know, this pattern of favoritism would become the foundation for far greater betrayals and revelations that would one day shatter the fragile illusion of familial harmony forever. Among the suffocating weight of my family's relentless favoritism, Grandma Martha was my lifeline, a beacon of unconditional support in a world that often felt cold and indifferent to who I truly was. Her small house, just 3 blocks away from ours, became my sanctuary when the walls of our homes seemed to close in on me. Every weekend, while Ava dazzled audiences at dance recitals or acting classes funded by mysterious savings, I would escape to Grandma Martha's kitchen, where she nurtured not only my curiosity, but also my fragile sense of self-worth. She taught me about constellations under the vast night sky, pointing out Orion's belt and Cassiopeia with a tenderness that made the universe feel less intimidating. "Your mind is a gift," she'd say, as we mixed baking soda and vinegar for makeshift volcanoes on her kitchen counter. Those words carried more weight than any accolade I later earned because they came from someone who saw me not as a disappointment, but as a brilliant spark waiting to ignite. But even Grandma Martha wasn't spared the judgmental glare of my parents' disapproval. They criticized her openly, accusing her of encouraging eccentricities and ruining Emily's femininity. Once, during one of Ava's ballet performances, my mother leaned over to whisper harshly into my ear, "If Grandma keeps filling your head with nonsense, you'll never learn how to be proper." The sting of those words lingered long after the applause faded, yet it only deepened my resolve to cling to the haven Grandma provided. While my parents dismissed my scientific interests as impractical or unbecoming, Grandma celebrated them. She listened intently when I explained the mechanics behind an old clock I had dismantled, her eyes lighting up with pride instead of derision. One particularly vivid memory stands out. I must have been 12, and I just received second place in a regional science fair for a project on renewable energy. My heart sank when my parents didn't attend the ceremony again, but Grandma showed up, cheering louder than anyone else in the auditorium. That evening, as we sat together in our backyard gazing at the stars, she handed me a battered copy of A Brief History of Time. "Never let anyone tell you what you're capable of," she said firmly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. It was then that I realized how much strength it took for her to defy my parents' expectations, not just for herself, but for me. Yet, this unwavering support came at a cost. My father once confronted her after discovering a chemistry set she had secretly bought for me. "What are you trying to do? Turn her into some kind of mad scientist?" He snapped, his face flushed with anger. Grandma stood her ground, her posture rigid despite her petite frame. "I'm trying to save her," she retorted, her tone sharp enough to silence him momentarily. Though their arguments left tension thick in the air, I cherished every moment she fought for me. In hindsight, her defiance planted the seeds of resilience within me, quiet rebellion against the narrative my family tried so desperately to impose. Little did I know, these early lessons would become the foundation upon which I built my future, a life defined not by their dismissals, but by the boundless potential Grandma believed I possessed. By the time I turned 14, my passion for science had already begun to bear fruit, though it felt more like bitter lemons than sweet oranges in the eyes of my family. That year, I won first place at the state science fair for a renewable energy project that could have real-world applications. It wasn't just any award. It was the culmination of months of late nights, endless calculations, and unwavering determination. My teachers were ecstatic, calling me into their offices to congratulate me personally. "This is groundbreaking work," one said, his voice trembling with excitement. Yet, when I called home to share the news, all I heard was silence on the other end of the line. Finally, my mother spoke, her tone dismissive. "Oh, Emily, that's nice, but we're taking Ava to an audition tomorrow. You understand, don't you?" The day of the awards ceremony arrived, and as I stood on stage accepting my trophy, I scanned the audience for familiar faces. But they weren't there. Instead, my parents were miles away, sitting in a drafty auditorium watching Ava deliver 3 lines in a local theater production. When I returned home later that evening, clutching my medal and certificate, I found them hosting a lavish celebration for Ava. The house was filled with relatives, balloons, and even a professional photographer snapping photos of my sister in her costume. My father raised a glass to toast Ava's brilliant performance, while my mother handed out slices of cake decorated with tiny edible stars, a nod to Ava's supposed star potential. Meanwhile, my achievement was brushed aside with a single offhand comment. "Oh, Emily still does those science things." It wasn't just the absence that stung, it was the deliberate erasure of my hard-earned success. As I sat quietly in the corner, listening to everyone gush over Ava's minor role, something inside me began to fracture. My grandmother Martha noticed, of course. She always did. Later that night, after the guests had left, she pulled me aside. "Your light doesn't dim because others refuse to see it," she whispered, holding my hand tightly. Her words offered some comfort, but they couldn't fully shield me from the weight of my family's indifference. What made it worse was how calculated their neglect seemed. Every milestone in my life was overshadowed by Ava's pursuits. While I spent hours poring over textbooks and perfecting experiments, Ava flitted between auditions and rehearsals, each step celebrated as though she were destined for greatness. And yet, here I was a teenager whose research had earned statewide recognition, reduced to nothing more than a footnote in my own family's narrative. Looking back, I realize now that this pattern of dismissal wasn't just hurtful, it was strategic. By downplaying my accomplishments, my parents reinforced the idea that Ava was the golden child, the one worth investing in. But what they failed to understand was that their rejection only fueled my resolve. Each snub became another reason to push harder, to prove not to them, but to myself that my dreams mattered. Still, the scars remained, buried beneath layers of unspoken resentment, waiting for the day when I would finally stop seeking their approval and start building a life where I didn't need it. 5 years ago, David and I met while collaborating on a research project. For the first time, I felt truly understood and valued for my passion for science, something my own family had never done. Our relationship grew naturally, from colleagues to friends, then lovers. When he proposed, it seemed like everything had finally fallen into place. I believed I'd found someone who saw me as worthy of love, not as the disappointing daughter or overlooked sibling. But cracks soon appeared. David began feeling overshadowed by my success, growing quietly competitive about publications and accolades. Meanwhile, Ava, ever the manipulator, sensed his insecurity. Under the pretense of checking in, she started visiting the lab more often, her interactions with David becoming increasingly flirtatory. Naively, I welcomed their bond, proud that they got along so well. The irony is crushing now. I was fostering what I thought was harmony, while they were betraying me behind my back. The day that shattered my world began innocently enough, or so I thought. It was late in the evening, and I'd stayed behind at the lab to finalize some data for a paper David and I were co-authoring. Our collaboration over the years had been seamless, professional, and built on mutual respect, or so I believed. The irony of it all now makes me sick to my stomach. As I walked toward his office, folder in hand, my engagement ring caught the fluorescent light, glinting mockingly as if it already knew what I was about to discover. When I pushed open the door without knocking, a habit born from familiarity, I froze mid-step. There they were. Ava, her designer dress hiked up around her waist, perched precariously on David's desk while he stood beside her, hands still resting possessively on her hips. For a moment, time seemed to stop. My mind raced through fragmented memories, their shared laughter at department gatherings, Ava's sudden interest in visiting me at work, David's subtle dismissals whenever I mentioned collaborating with him again. All the pieces clicked into place, but instead of clarity bringing relief, it felt like a vice tightening around my chest. Ava was the first to react, smoothing her skirt with an air of nonchalance that made my blood boil. "Oh, Emily," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Don't make such a big deal out of this." Her words hit me like a slap, sharp and humiliating. She didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. Instead, she adjusted her hair in the reflection of David's computer screen, acting as though she'd just been caught borrowing a pen, not destroying my future. Meanwhile, David stammered something incomprehensible, his face pale under the harsh laboratory lights. But I barely heard him. My eyes were locked onto the diamond ring on my finger, its sparkle suddenly cruel and alien. How could something meant to symbolize love feel so heavy, so wrong? What hurt most wasn't just the betrayal, it was the realization that neither of them cared enough to hide it better. They hadn't bothered to lock the door or dim the lights. To them, I was an afterthought, someone whose feelings could be brushed aside without consequence. And Ava, my own sister, who had spent decades basking in our parents' adoration while I quietly pursued my dreams, had once again taken what wasn't hers. Only this time she hadn't stolen the spotlight. She'd stolen my fiancé. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, to throw the folder of research I'd worked tirelessly on straight at their faces. But I couldn't move. My legs felt rooted to the floor, my breath shallow and uneven. In that moment, I realized how deeply entrenched their disregard for me truly was. This wasn't just about David or Ava, it was about a lifetime of being overlooked, dismissed, and undervalued. And yet, even as my heart shattered, a flicker of resolve ignited within me. I wouldn't let them reduce me to a victim. Not this time. The betrayal I uncovered in David's office wasn't just a personal wound. It was the catalyst for an even more devastating revelation about my family's priorities. When I finally confronted my parents, their reaction was not one of outrage or concern for my well-being, but rather a desperate scramble to protect Ava and her carefully constructed facade. Sitting across from them at our kitchen table, I could barely choke out the words before my mother interrupted me with frantic pleas. "Emily, you can't tell Richard. Do you understand what this will do to her? She'll lose everything." Her voice trembled, not with sorrow for my pain, but with panic over the potential unraveling of Ava's marriage and, by extension, her reputation. Their disregard for my emotions was staggering. Instead of asking how I felt or offering support, they bombarded me with guilt-laden arguments designed to silence me. My father leaned forward, his tone sharp and accusatory. "You've always been difficult, Emily, but this is your chance to be the bigger person." Think about your sister's future. The irony burned like acid after decades of being told I was too ambitious, too independent. Now I was somehow expected to sacrifice my dignity for the sake of harmony. They painted Ava as the victim, claiming she had simply made a mistake while conveniently ignoring the fact that she had betrayed both her husband and her own sister. What followed was relentless pressure, a barrage of phone calls, texts, and surprise visits aimed at coercing me into compliance. My mother sobbed hysterically during one call, accusing me of destroying the family dynamic. "If you don't forgive her," she warned, her voice cold despite her tears, "we'll have no choice but to cut ties." "Is that what you want? To lose your entire family?" It was a threat cloaked as concern, yet another manipulation tactic meant to keep me tethered to their toxic orbit. Even my aunt chimed in, echoing their sentiments. "Ava needs us right now. You're strong, you can handle this." But beneath their carefully crafted rhetoric lay a deeper truth. My family would always prioritize Ava's image over my happiness. This wasn't new, it was merely an escalation of the pattern I'd endured my entire life. From childhood accolades to adult achievements, my successes were overshadowed, minimized, or ignored entirely. Now, faced with the ultimate betrayal, I realized they saw me not as a daughter who deserved justice, but as a pawn in their endless quest to preserve Ava's pedestal. Each conversation left me feeling hollow, as though my identity had been reduced to a bargaining chip. Yet, something inside me began to shift. Their attempts to control me only fueled a growing resolve, a quiet rebellion against the narrative they had imposed on me for so long. For the first time, I questioned whether maintaining this so-called family peace was worth sacrificing my own integrity. Little did they know, their desperation to shield Ava would ultimately push me closer to breaking free from their suffocating grip forever. In the aftermath of discovering David and Ava's betrayal, I found myself adrift, untethered from the life I thought I had built. It was during this turbulent time that I met Michael at a university fundraising event, 45-year-old architect tasked with designing our new research facility. At first, his presence felt like an unexpected reprieve. He listened to me with genuine curiosity as I explained my work, asking thoughtful questions about how science and design could intersect. Unlike David, who often turned their conversations into competitions over whose achievements mattered more, Michael engaged with me as an equal, valuing both my intellect and my humanity. Over dinners and late-night discussions, I began opening up to him about the weight I carried for decades, the relentless comparisons to Ava, the dismissive comments from my parents, the suffocating pressure to shrink myself. So Ava could shine. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to downplay my struggles or mask my pain. Michael's analytical mind processed every word, his architect's perspective offering clarity where there had only been chaos. After one particularly raw conversation, he paused, his expression serious yet gentle. "In architecture," he said, "we sometimes encounter buildings that look flawless on the outside, but are structurally unsound. No amount of cosmetic repair can fix them. In those cases, the most compassionate choice is to dismantle what no longer serves its purpose and build something stronger, something real." His metaphor struck a chord deep within me. He continued, "You've spent 42 years trying to preserve a family structure that was never designed to support you. Maybe it's time to let go of what doesn't work and create a life rooted in mutual respect and love." His words ignited something fierce inside me, a resolve to stop patching the cracks in relationships that were beyond saving. That night, as we sat under the soft glow of cafe lights, I realized I deserved better than the toxic dynamics I'd endured. We decided then that we would marry not out of obligation or tradition, but because we shared a vision for a future defined by authenticity and partnership. For once, I wasn't just someone's overlooked daughter or betrayed fiancée. With Michael, I became whole, a woman ready to rebuild her foundation, brick by brick, on terms that honored who I truly was. As the date of my wedding to Michael approached, I made a deliberate decision. This would not be a grand spectacle for my family to hijack. It would be an intimate celebration of love and authenticity. I envisioned a small ceremony in the botanical gardens, surrounded only by those who had truly supported me throughout my life. My guest list included Grandma Martha, a few close relatives like Aunt Linda, who would always champion me, my colleagues who valued my work, and Michael's family, whose warmth and sincerity had already made me feel more accepted than my own parents ever did. Crucially, I excluded my parents and Ava not out of spite, but because I knew they would turn the day into yet another performance centered around Ava. She thrived on attention, and I refused to let her overshadow what was meant to be my moment. But Ava predictably couldn't accept being left out. Just days before the wedding, I learned through Aunt Linda that she had purchased an extravagant white dress, far too ornate for a morning garden ceremony, and declared it would show everyone who the real star is. The audacity of her words left me seething. It wasn't enough that she had betrayed me with David. Now she intended to steal the spotlight at my wedding, as if the day were about her all along. Worse still, my parents secretly encouraged her plan. They whispered reassurances that she deserved to shine, even going so far as to share details of the venue and timing without my permission. Their betrayal cut deeper than ever before. They weren't just supporting her selfishness. They were actively undermining my happiness. When I confronted them, their excuses were infuriatingly hollow. "We're doing this for your own good," my mother pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "Ava needs us right now. You can't hold a grudge forever." As though forgiving her infidelity and manipulation was somehow my responsibility. Meanwhile, Ava pranced around in her designer gown during fittings. POSTING cryptic social media updates hinting at a surprise appearance no one asked for. Each photo felt like a dagger reminder that she saw my special day as nothing more than another stage for her theatrics. Despite the chaos brewing behind the scenes, I remained resolute. This wedding wasn't about pleasing anyone else. It was about creating something genuine, untainted by decades of favoritism and drama. With Michael by my side, we prepared security measures to ensure Ava wouldn't disrupt the ceremony. For once, I was determined to protect my joy from those who sought to destroy it. The morning of my wedding was supposed to be a celebration of love, authenticity, and new beginnings. Instead, it became the stage for one final explosive act of betrayal orchestrated by Ava and my parents. As I stood in the bridal suite, adjusting the delicate lace of my gown, chaos erupted outside. Through the window, I saw Ava sweep into the botanical gardens like a self-proclaimed princess, her white dress shimmering under the sunlight, a blatant attempt to steal the spotlight on my day. My parents trailed behind her, pleading with security guards who had been explicitly instructed not to let her in. Grandma Martha, sharp as ever at 92, planted herself firmly at the entrance, refusing to budge despite their emotional theatrics. When I stepped out to confront them, still clad in my wedding dress, something inside me snapped. "Emily, how could you do this to me? I came here to support you," Ava cried, her voice dripping with feigned innocence. But before I could respond, Richard's car screeched into the parking lot. His arrival sent shockwaves through the scene. He strode toward us, his face a mixture of confusion and fury. What followed was a confrontation so raw and unfiltered that it left everyone breathless. "Ava," Richard began, his voice trembling, "is there something you need to tell me about David?" Before she could deny it, David's call pierced the air. He'd phoned her, oblivious to the audience. On speakerphone, his casual question hung heavily. "Are you still coming over later?" The silence that followed was deafening. Ava crumbled, mascara streaking down her cheeks as she admitted everything. "I did it because I was bored. And I couldn't stand that Emily finally had something I didn't." Her words cut through the tension like a knife, exposing the ugliness beneath her polished facade. My mother gasped, clutching her chest, while my father looked away in shame. For once, they were silent and able to spin this disaster into another narrative. Richard's expression hardened as he turned and walked away without another word, leaving Ava chasing after him in tears. The truth, laid bare in front of our guests, shattered any illusion of perfection my family had clung to for decades. In that moment, I realized the full extent of Ava's selfishness, and my parents' complicity in enabling it. Yet amidst the wreckage, I felt an unexpected sense of liberation. Their actions no longer defined me. I was ready to step into a future built on honesty and mutual respect with Michael by my side. After the explosive confrontation at the entrance of the botanical gardens, a strange calm settled over the scene. Richard's departure with Ava trailing behind him left an eerie silence in its wake, but it also marked a turning point, a moment where the chaos orchestrated by my family finally unraveled under the weight of their own deceit. As I stood there in my wedding dress, trembling from both anger and relief, something remarkable happened. The remaining guests, my coworkers, Michael's family, Grandma Martha, and a few close relatives who had always seen me for who I truly was, formed a protective circle around Michael and me. It wasn't just symbolic. It felt like a fortress of love and solidarity, shielding us from the toxicity that had plagued my life for so long. Michael took my hand, his grip steady and reassuring as he leaned in to whisper, "We're doing this, no matter what." His words carried the weight of everything we'd been through together, the late-night conversations about my fractured family, the quiet understanding when I needed space, and his unwavering belief in me as more than just Emily, the scientist, or Emily, the overlooked daughter. In that moment, surrounded by people who genuinely cared for me, I realized how far I'd come from the girl who once sought validation from those who refused to give it. When Michael's mother, a retired judge with a commanding yet compassionate presence, stepped forward and asked, "Shall we have a wedding?" the tension melted away. Her voice broke through the lingering unease, reminding everyone why we were there, to celebrate love, not drama. As Michael and I exchanged vows beneath the morning sun, dappled light filtering through the trees, I felt a profound sense of peace. Michael's promises moved me to tears. "I vow to see you not for what others expect you to be, but for who you are. To cherish your brilliance, your resilience, and your heart. And to build a life rooted in mutual respect, free from the shadows of anyone else's expectations." The ceremony was intimate and beautiful, a stark contrast to the spectacle Ava and my parents had tried to create. My Aunt Linda later told me that Richard was filing for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences, and that Ava would receive nothing due to their prenuptial agreement. But none of that mattered now. For the first time, I allowed myself to fully embrace the joy of being surrounded by people who loved me for me. As Grandma Martha hugged me tightly afterward, she whispered, "You've always been enough, dear. Now go start your new chapter." With Michael by my side, I walked away from the wreckage of my past, ready to step into a future defined by authenticity, love, and unshakable support. In the aftermath of the wedding, the fallout from Ava's actions rippled through what remained of our fractured family. Richard filed for divorce shortly after confronting her about the affair with David, and thanks to their prenuptial agreement, Ava was left with nothing, no alimony, no share of his wealth. Just the cold reality of her choices crashing down around her. It was a bitter reckoning, one that mirrored the emptiness she had sown in others' lives for years. My parents, who had spent decades propping up Ava as their golden child, were now inconsolable. They called me daily, their voices trembling not with concern for my happiness, but with desperation over how to salvage Ava's crumbling existence. "She has nowhere to go," my mother pleaded during one particularly grating phone call. "You're her sister. Can't you help her?" The irony was staggering. They finally needed me, but only because Ava had burned every bridge she'd ever crossed. For the first time in my life, I refused to play my part in their twisted drama. I didn't owe Ava anything, not forgiveness, not support, not even the pretense of civility. She betrayed me in ways that cut deeper than any familial bond could withstand, and I was done sacrificing myself on the altar of their expectations. "Mom," I said firmly, cutting through her pleas, "this is the consequence of her actions. Not everything can be fixed by asking someone else to clean up the mess." My words hung heavy in the silence that followed, a stark departure from the accommodating daughter they had always known. As Ava struggled to adjust to life without Richard's financial safety net or the adoration she so desperately craved, Michael and I began building a future rooted in mutual respect and shared dreams. Our honeymoon in New Zealand was more than a celebration of love. It was a testament to the life we envisioned together, blending science and adventure in perfect harmony. Grandma Martha's voice echoed in my mind when she called to check on me. Strength isn't about enduring pain. It's about choosing joy when you've been given the chance. For once, I took her advice to heart. Back home, my research flourished under renewed focus, bolstered by Michael's unwavering belief in me. Together, we created something real, a partnership built on authenticity rather than obligation. Meanwhile, my parents' pleas grew quieter, their desperation palpable yet powerless against my resolve. I no longer felt tethered to their toxic orbit. For the first time, I understood what true freedom felt like. The ability to define my own worth, unburdened by their judgments or Ava's manipulations. As I stood in my lab one evening, watching the sunset paint the walls gold, I realized I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. And this time, I owed it all to myself.